A little disclaimer before we get into the text today. If you're watching this around your kids, if you're at home and there's kids around, put some headphones on, or watch this at a time when kids aren't around. So there are certain parts of Scripture that are fairly explicit, and my assumption in these videos is that I'm talking to either teenagers or adults, so people who kind of have a maturity level to handle some of the more explicit details that we find in Genesis. So with that being said, we go to 37. And a lot of people, when they start 37, they think, okay, we talked about Abraham, we talked about Isaac, we talked about Jacob, and now we're going to spend the rest of the book talking about Joseph. The reason people think that is because there's a lot about Joseph in this section. But we're still talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What we see in 37 through the rest of the book of Genesis, chapter 50, what we see in these chapters is how God brought Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's family into Egypt, and how other nations were blessed through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are going to see surrounding nations of Egypt be blessed through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's family. So it gets really good in these chapters. So keep on reading. 37 starts out, Jacob obviously has a favorite child. So much, he's so obvious about that the other brothers get jealous, they get envious, and they end up trafficking Joseph, seeking to sell him into slavery. It's a terrible thing they did. And they tell their father, Jacob, that Joseph is actually dead. Now, when we go to 38, and we look at verse 8. So Judah is one of the sons of Jacob. Judah's son dies, and he has another son who's culturally obligated to carry on the family line of his brother. And so he tells his son Onan to have sex with his sister-in-law so that his brother's line may be spread. And there's a lot more details happening here with how inheritance works and all that. But I just want you to remember, at this time, in this context, there was no life insurance. There was no Social Security. And so this woman, Tamar, if she doesn't have a child, if she doesn't have her husband's inheritance from that son, then she basically has to sell herself into prostitution. So at this time, it's a justice requirement that Onan continues his brother's line. Without that, Tamar has no ethical way to support herself. And so Judah tells his son, do what you got to do to carry on your brother's line. And when he has sex, every single time, he pulls out so that his brother's line wouldn't be continued. Onan is saying, I'll take the pleasure of sex, but I'm not going to give up part of my inheritance, right? I want my brother's inheritance. I don't want to give that inheritance to some kid born after me. This is selfish. Later in the chapter, we see Judah promise Tamar that when one of his younger sons gets old enough, that through that son, the line of Tamar and her late husband would continue. But Judah never follows through with that promise. And so one day, Tamar dresses up like a prostitute and has sex with Judah. Judah didn't know that it was Tamar. Well, it's found out that she's actually pregnant. And the men say, we need to put this woman to death. It's immorality. And Judah agrees. But then in 26, after Tamar had showed who she was, Judah says this, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son. In this strange, dysfunctional way, Judah recognizes his unrighteousness, that he didn't give Tamar what she was due, that he forced her into a situation where she had to become a prostitute. Judah, who sold his brother into slavery. Judah, who didn't think about his daughter-in-law, who was a widow, learns righteousness through Tamar's action. This is one of those sections where it's very important that we remember that not everything described in the Bible is prescribed in the Bible. Okay? If your brother dies, you're not obligated to keep his line going with your sister-in-law. Not everything that's described in the Bible is prescribed in the Bible. But what do we see here? We see Judah is learning righteousness. Judah sold his brother into slavery, overlooked the needs of a widow, and he's learning righteousness. And what line did Jesus come through? The line of Judah. Jesus is the Lion of Judah. Judah must learn righteousness, because through his offspring will come Jesus, the Messiah. We're going to see later in Genesis that Judah did in fact learn righteousness. But today, as you read this section, think about, are there ways that you're ignoring the needs of your own family? Are there ways that you're overlooking the orphans and the widows around you? Are there ways that you're exchanging money for pleasure? Think through these things. And remember, Jesus calls you to follow him today.